The wind screamed across the ridge at 90 kilometers per hour. Ice crystals bit into exposed skin like shrapnel. Through the whiteout, Hauptmann Heinz Groth could barely make out the silhouette of the Hut, a dark smudge against the endless white of the Elbrus glacier. It was August 14, 1942, and Groth's reconnaissance company had just crossed the Whiteout Pass at over 3,400 meters. They were utterly alone, separated from the main force by kilometers of glacier and rock. Ahead of them stood the Elbrus House, an aluminum-covered mountain shelter built by the Soviets 3 years earlier for Western tourists. Now it served as a barracks for Soviet Highland troops. 80 men. Armed. Waiting. Groth's orders were simple: seize the highest point in Europe. Plant the swastika on Mount Elbrus. Show the world that the Wehrmacht could conquer even the roof of the continent. What happened next would make Adolf Hitler rage for hours. It would become one of the most bizarre propaganda victories and strategic failures of the entire Caucasus campaign. And it would end with German mountain troops trapped in a frozen hell, fighting an enemy they could never defeat, the mountains themselves. This is the story of Operation Edelweiss. The story of how Germany's elite mountain soldiers climbed into hell and how most of them never climbed back out. To understand what brought Heinz Groth to that frozen mountainside in August 1942, we need to go back 6 weeks to July 23, 1942, and to a headquarters 1,500 kilometers to the north. Adolf Hitler was staring at a map. Not the map of Stalingrad that would soon consume his attention. This map showed something far more valuable: the Caucasus. The mountain range that separated the Soviet Union from the Middle East. And beneath those mountains oil. Hitler's war machine ran on petroleum. Romanian oil from Ploesti. Captured Soviet oil from the Ukrainian fields. But it wasn't enough. The panzer divisions, the Luftwaffe, the entire Wehrmacht consumed fuel at a rate that made sustainable warfare impossible. By mid-1942, Germany was literally running on fumes. The solution, Hitler believed, lay in the Caucasus. The oil fields at Makop, at Grozny, and most critically, at Baku on the Caspian Sea, which produced 70% of the Soviet Union's oil. Capture those fields, and Germany could fuel a global war for decades. Deny them to Stalin, and the Red Army would grind to a halt within months. On July 23, Hitler issued Führer Directive 45. The operation would be called Edelweiss, named after the small white flower that grew at high altitudes, the symbol worn by German mountain troops. Army Group A, commanded by Generalfeldmarschall Wilhelm List, would drive south from Rostov-on through the Caucasus Mountains to the oilfields beyond. The force List commanded was formidable: over 167,000 troops, 4,540 artillery pieces, 1,130 tanks. Supporting them would be elements of Luftflotte 4, over 1,000 aircraft under the command of Wolfram von Richthofen. The Romanian Third Army would protect the flanks. Before the operation even began, German oil companies Deutsche Oil auf Caucasus, Ostoil, and Carpathen Oil had already been established. They even brought 15,000 oil industry workers along with the invasion force. Hitler was so confident that he ordered the Luftwaffe not to bomb the Caucasian oil towers. Special equipment and pipes for pumping crude oil arrived from Germany before the first shot was fired. But the most critical units, the spearhead that would actually cross the Caucasus, were Germany's mountain divisions. Specifically, the 1st Mountain Division, nicknamed Edelweiss, and the 4th Mountain Division, called Enzian, after another alpine flower. Together, they formed the 49th Mountain Corps under General der Gebirgstruppe Rudolf Conrad. These weren't ordinary infantry. These were Gebirgsjäger mountain hunters. Most came from Bavaria and Austria, from the Tyrol and the Alps. They had trained in the mountains since childhood. Skiing, climbing, surviving in conditions that would kill normal troops. They wore the Edelweiss badge with pride. And they had already proven themselves in Poland, France, and Yugoslavia. The 1st Mountain Division was commanded by General der Gebirgstruppe Hubert Lanz, a hard, competent officer who understood mountain warfare. Under him served men like Heinz Groth, a Hauptmann, a captain in the reconnaissance company. Groth was 31 years old. a veteran climber. Before the war, he had scaled peaks across the Alps. Now he would command the vanguard detachment, 150 men who would push ahead of the main force to seize the critical mountain passes. On July 25, 1942, German troops captured Rostov-on-Don. The gates of the Caucasus were open. The advance began immediately. Von Kleist's 1st Panzer Army rolled south across the steppe, crushing Soviet resistance. By August 10th, they had reached the starting line, Krasnodar, Pyatigorsk, Makeup. The oil fields were tantalizingly close. Makeup fell on August 9, but the Soviets had demolished the wells. It would take months to restore production. But Hitler didn't care about Makeup anymore. He wanted Baku. And to reach Baku, Army Group A would have to cross the greatest mountain range in Europe, the Caucasus. The Caucasus Mountains are not like the Alps. They are higher, wider, more savage. Mount Elbrus, the highest peak, stands at 5,642 meters higher than any mountain in Western Europe. The passes through the range sit at altitudes above 3,000 meters. The weather is unpredictable and lethal. Blizzards can strike in August. Avalanches kill without warning. Even today, Mount Elbrus claims an average of 15 to 30 lives every year. The Soviets knew this. They had spent years mapping the passes, building defensive positions. When German reconnaissance flights reported that Soviet forces were streaming south toward the passes in late July, it was clear the battle for the Caucasus would be fought in the mountains. General Land studied his maps in early August. The Wehrmacht's plan was ambitious, perhaps insanely so. The 1st Mountain Division would advance through the river gorges of the Kuban Basin. Their objectives: the Maruk Pass, the Klukar Pass, and the heights around Mount Elbrus. Meanwhile, the 4th Mountain Division would push toward the Sanchero Pass. If they succeeded, they could descend to the Black Sea coast to Sukhumi, Zugdidi, even the Georgian capital Tbilisi. The operational concept was sound. Mountain troops, advancing through terrain where armor and regular infantry couldn't follow, would outflank the Soviet defensive lines and open the way for the main force. The plan assumed something critical: that the mountain divisions could move quickly, supply themselves across trackless wilderness, and defeat whatever Soviet forces they encountered. It assumed wrong on all 3 counts. The 49th Mountain Corps came to the Caucasus well prepared on paper, at least. They had specialized mountain signals units equipped with mules trailing telephone wire from wooden spools on their backs, linking units along mile after mile of forested valleys and steep, rocky tracks. Radio operators spent days atop isolated rocky peaks acting as solitary relays for messages. They had highly trained mountain artillery batteries with specially designed lightweight howitzers capable of being dismantled and transported along rough terrain by teams of as few as 10 mules, firing 875 mm high explosive shells per minute at enemies as far as 9 kilometers away. But reality intervened before they even reached the mountains. After a long and arduous journey south along dusty roads and under the blazing summer sun 600 kilometers from their crossing over the Don River near Rostov, the German mountain troops needed to rest and regroup. Worse still, the 2nd Romanian Mountain Division and 3 divisions of Italian Alpini were ordered to detach themselves from the Corps and head for the front around Stalingrad. A rifle battalion and a battery of mountain artillery were transferred to the 1st Panzer Army. The 4th Air Corps, whose support the mountain troops had been firmly promised, was transferred to Italy. From the outset, pitted against the might of the Red Army in the Caucasus Mountains and the unbelievable ambition of its political masters back in Berlin, the German Army's 49th Mountain Corps had all the striking power of a flea. Its pathetically small, isolated fighting units were swallowed up in the vastness of the Caucasus. And there was another problem. The 49th Mountain Corps was advancing towards Sukhumi with tourist guidebooks in place of maps. The largest map they acquired was at a scale of 1:200,000, far too small for tactical planning. The Germans concluded that the most effective path toward the southern Caucasus was through the Sukhumi military road. However, they did not have proper surveillance to deduce that the road was paved for a mere 40 kilometers, with the subsequent 105 kilometers consisting of narrow cart pathways. The majority of the distance would be covered on foot, and supplying the German force would prove nearly impossible. But orders were orders. General Lanz divided his forces. To seize the approaches to Elbrus and secure the division's right flank, he formed a vanguard detachment under Hauptmann Heinz Groth. 150 men. Experienced climbers. They carried light weapons, rifles, machine guns, mortars. Heavy equipment was impossible in the mountains. Every kilogram had to be justified. Their route, from Old Karakay, through the Kurzuk Aul settlement, up the Ulukam Gorge, to the Kodiatau Pass. From there, they would descend toward Mount Elbrus and seize the high ground controlling the passes, Dangazorin, Assau, Nacker. On August 12th, Groth's detachment began their ascent. The first days were grueling but manageable. They followed goat trails through the gorges. Local Karakay guides, some willing, some coerced, showed them the paths. Mules carried supplies. The weather held. But as they climbed higher, conditions worsened. The trails disappeared. The men were now scrambling over rock and ice. The air grew thin at 3,000 meters. Every breath required effort. Men who could march 30 kilometers on flat ground found themselves exhausted after 2 kilometers of climbing. The temperature dropped. At night, it fell below freezing. During the day, the sun reflected off the snow with blinding intensity. On August 13th, they reached the Kodiatau Pass at 3,400 meters. Soviet scouts had missed that the pass was undefended. It was a stroke of extraordinary luck. The pass was immediately renamed the Pass of General Conrad, after the commander of the 49th Mountain Corps. From the pass, Groth could see their objective, Mount Elbrus, rising impossibly high against the sky. Even in August, it was covered in snow and ice. The twin peaks, the western summit at 5,642 meters and the eastern summit at 5,621 meters, stood like sentinels over the entire Caucasus. And there, at 4,200 meters on the southern slope, stood the Elbrus house. Groth sent forward Por Schneider from the 54th Mountain Reconnaissance Troop with a patrol. They approached the hut carefully, positioning themselves in the rocks around it. The Soviet garrison later reported to be around 80 men could have annihilated them. What happened next is one of those small moments that change the course of battles. Hauptmann Groth, rather than waiting for his company, climbed to the hut alone. He was immediately captured by the Soviet troops inside. Picture the scene: a German officer, alone, surrounded by dozens of armed Soviet soldiers in a mountain hut at over 4,000 meters altitude. His company is scattered across the rocks outside. One burst of gunfire and Groth would be dead. His mission failed before it truly began. Groth did something unexpected. He negotiated. The exact words exchanged in that hut on August 14, 1942, are lost to history. We know only the outcome. Groth made an agreement. He offered the Soviet garrison safe passage off the mountain if they handed over the Elbrus house and its associated weather station. They could leave. No one would be harmed. The Soviet commander agreed. Why? Perhaps the garrison knew they were cut off, that German forces controlled the passes behind them. Perhaps they were low on supplies. Perhaps they simply didn't want to die defending a mountain hut in the middle of nowhere. Soviet records don't say. But within hours, the 80-man garrison had evacuated, and Groth's reconnaissance company occupied the Elbrus house. It was a bloodless victory, and it gave the Germans a crucial foothold. The Elbrus house was more than shelter. It was a strategic position. Built in 1939 by the Soviet tourist agency Interest, the aluminum-covered structure could house over 100 men. It had supplies, food, clothing, climbing equipment. Most importantly, it commanded the approaches from the Elbrus glacier to the passes beyond Dangazorin, Assau, Nacker that led south toward Sukhumi. General Hubert Lanz would later write that the capture of the Elbrus house was of considerable tactical importance. From that position, German forces could control the mountain warfare in the entire sector. It was, in his view, far more militarily significant than what happened next. Because once Groth's men secured the hut, they looked up at the twin peaks of Mount Elbrus towering above them. The western peak, 5,642 meters. The eastern peak, 5,621 meters. The highest points in Europe. And someone history doesn't record exactly who had an idea. Why not climb it? The decision to summit Mount Elbrus wasn't made at division headquarters. It wasn't ordered by General Lanz or General Conrad. It came from the mountain troops themselves, men who had spent their lives climbing peaks, who saw Europe's highest mountain and felt the pull that all climbers feel. The summit was there. It was within reach. And they were German Gebirgsjäger. They could do this. The idea quickly gained momentum. A joint expedition from both the 1st and 4th Mountain Divisions would be formed. 23 men total. They would climb to both summits, plant the Reich War flag and the divisional flags of both mountain divisions, take photographs for the propaganda companies, and prove to the world that German mountain troops could conquer anything, even the roof of Europe. The team was led by 2 Hauptmänner, Heinz Groth from the 1st Mountain Division and Max Gammerler from the 4th. 14 climbers came from the 1st Division, 9 from the 4th. Among them was Oberfeldwebel Lorenz Kummerl, who would carry the Reich War flag to the summit. They set out from the Elbrus house on August 20th. The weather cooperated, a rarity on Elbrus. The notorious mountain, which even today claims 20 lives per year on average, offered the Germans a pristine window of opportunity. Clear skies. Light winds. Perfect conditions. The ascent of Elbrus is not technically difficult. There are no vertical rock faces, no deadly ice walls. But the altitude is punishing. At 5,600 meters, there is 40% less oxygen than at sea level. Every step becomes a battle. Your heart pounds. Your lungs burn. Your legs feel like they're made of lead. And the cold is relentless. Even in summer, temperatures at the summit can drop to minus 30 degrees Celsius. Frostbite is a constant threat. But these were not ordinary climbers. These were men who had trained for years in the Alps, who had climbed in conditions that would kill untrained soldiers. They knew how to pace themselves, how to breathe, how to push through the pain. They climbed through the night, using the hard-packed snow of the pre-dawn hours when the mountain was most stable. As the sun rose on August 21, 1942, the team approached the western summit, the highest point not just in the Caucasus, not just in Russia, but in all of Europe. At 11 a.m., Oberfeldwebel Lorenz Kummerl stood on the peak. The wind whipped around him, but the sky was clear. Below, the entire Caucasus spread out like a frozen sea. Behind him, the rest of the team struggled up the final meters. Kummerl planted the Reich War flag. The blood-red banner with the black swastika snapped in the wind. Next to it, the flags of the 1st and 4th Mountain Divisions were raised. The photographer from the 666th Propaganda Company captured the moment. German soldiers on the highest point in Europe. The symbol of German power and conquest. It was a propaganda coup. The images would be broadcast across Germany, shown in newsreels, printed in newspapers. Look what the Wehrmacht has achieved. Not even the mountains can stop us. But there was one man who did not celebrate. Adolf Hitler was at his headquarters, the Wolfschanz in East Prussia, when the news arrived. A telegram from Army Group A. German mountain troops have successfully reached the summit of Mount Elbrus. Flags have been planted. Hitler exploded. According to architect Albert Speer, who was present, Hitler's rage was extraordinary even by his standards. I often saw Hitler furious, Speer would later recall. But seldom did his anger erupt from him as it did when this report came in. 4 hours he raged as if his entire plan of the campaign had been ruined by this bit of sport. Why was Hitler so enraged? The Führer, a man who worshipped symbolism, who understood the power of propaganda better than almost anyone, should have celebrated this achievement. But Hitler saw it differently. "Those crazy mountain climbers!" he screamed. "They belong before a court-martial. They were pursuing their idiotic hobbies in the midst of a war." Days later, he was still ranting. "Occupying an idiotic peak even though I had commanded that all efforts must be concentrated upon Sukhumi." Hitler's fury was rooted in strategic reality. While 23 men had spent days climbing a mountain, The advance toward the Black Sea coast toward the critical port of Sukhumi had stalled. The 17th Army, advancing from the north, was bogged down trying to capture Novorossiysk and Tuapse. If Sukhumi fell, combined with those northern ports, the Soviet Black Sea Fleet would be crippled. Germany could ferry troops and supplies across the Kerch Straits. The entire southern flank would be secured. But Sukhumi wasn't falling. And now Hitler learned that his elite mountain troops, the spearhead of the entire Caucasus offensive, had diverted time and resources to climb a mountain that had zero military value. Hitler threatened to court-martial General Lanz. The threat was never carried out. Even Hitler knew that punishing a successful general in the middle of a campaign was insane. But the damage was done. The relationship between Hitler and his field commanders, already strained, deteriorated further. And Hitler's instincts, as much as we might hate to admit it, were correct. The climb to Elbrus was symbolic. It looked impressive. But it meant nothing strategically. While photographers snapped pictures of flags on a frozen peak, the real war was being lost in the valleys below. Because while Groth and Gammerler's team had been climbing Elbrus, the rest of the 49th Mountain Corps had been fighting for its life. On August 15, the same day the Elbrus team was preparing for their ascent, German mountain troops had attacked the Kluker Pass. The Kluker was one of the key routes through the Caucasus, leading directly towards Sukhumi on the Black Sea coast. It sat at 2,781 meters, high enough to be brutal, low enough to be strategically critical. The Soviets knew this. The pass was defended by the 1st and 2nd Rifle Companies, a mortar platoon, 2 sapper squadrons, 218 men total with 189 rifles, 14 machine guns for mortars. It wasn't a large force, but they had the advantage of terrain. The pass was a natural fortress. German Gebirgsjäger advanced up the northern slope. The Soviets had one advantage the Germans didn't expect. They herded sheep ahead of their defensive positions. The animals, which had crossed the passes countless times, found trails through the snow and rocks that weren't on any map. The Germans, seeing movement, advanced cautiously, only to be caught in a killing zone when Soviet troops opened fire from concealed positions. The fighting was savage. From August 15th to 19th, the battle for the Kluker and nearby Nacker passes cost the Soviets 239 men killed, 34 wounded, 3 missing. But the Germans were stopped. The pass held. 80 kilometers to the east, another battle was raging at the Maruk Pass. The 4th Mountain Division, advancing through the Mali-Zelenchuk River Valley, had reached the pass by mid-August. The fighting here was even more brutal than at Kluker. The Soviets had fortified the pass with everything they had: machine gun nests, mortar positions, snipers. The Germans attacked repeatedly. Artillery, those lightweight 75mm mountain howitzers, pounded Soviet positions. Gebirgsjäger stormed upward through snow and rock, taking casualties with every meter. But slowly they advanced. By late August, the Maruk Pass had fallen. German troops began descending the southern slope. But they couldn't exploit the victory. The logistics were impossible. Mules could only carry so much. The narrow trails meant that supplying a large force was impossible. Food ran short. Ammunition ran low. Medical supplies were non-existent. Men wounded in battle had to be carried back up the mountain, a journey that often took days and killed as many men from exposure as from their wounds. And then there was the weather. In late August, the perfect climbing conditions that had blessed the Elbrus expedition disappeared. Storms rolled in from the Black Sea. Snow fell in sheets. Temperatures plummeted. Men who had been sweating in the August sun were now fighting frostbite and hypothermia. Avalanches swept through valleys, burying entire patrols. One account from Oberjäger Alfred Richter, who served with the 2nd Hochgebirgsjäger Battalion, describes the conditions. "We had no idea where we were half the time. The maps were useless. We followed animal trails when we could find them. At night, we dug into the snow and huddled together for warmth. Men froze to death in their sleep. We'd wake up and find them stiff, covered in frost. We couldn't even bury them properly. We just had to leave them and keep moving." The German advance was grinding to a halt. Not because of Soviet resistance, though, that was fierce, but because of the mountains themselves. The Caucasus were defeating the Wehrmacht more effectively than any Red Army division could. By early September, General Rudolf Conrad, commander of the 49th Mountain Corps, sent a message to headquarters. His recommendation was stark: allocate minimal forces to defend the passes they had taken and cease the advance. Do not, under any circumstances, attempt to push all the way to Tuapse as planned. Hitler's response was predictable. He was furious. How dare a general suggest retreat? How dare he recommend abandoning the offensive? Conrad was relieved of command shortly afterward, though whether this was directly due to his recommendation or for other reasons remains unclear. But events elsewhere would soon make the debate moot. On November 19, 1942, the Soviet Union launched Operation Uranus, the counteroffensive at Stalingrad. Within days, the German Sixth Army was encircled. Over 250,000 men were trapped. The entire southern front was collapsing. Hitler faced a choice: try to relieve Stalingrad, or continue the Caucasus offensive. He chose Stalingrad. Army Group A received new orders: withdraw. Pull back from the Caucasus. Establish a defensive line at the Kuban bridgehead, and prepare to send forces north to relieve the trapped 6th Army. For the 49th Mountain Corps, the order came in late December: abandon the passes. Retreat north. It was a nightmare. The same mountain trails that had been so difficult to climb in August were now covered in meters of snow. The temperature had dropped to -20, -30 degrees. Mules froze to death on the trails. Men suffered frostbite so severe that entire platoons lost fingers, toes, ears. Some lost feet. The retreat was supposed to be orderly, but quickly descended into chaos. Soviet forces, sensing the German withdrawal, launched attacks. Parties of Red Army mountain troops ambushed German columns in the narrow gorges. Men who survived the fighting often died from exposure. Bodies were left where they felt there was no time, no energy to carry them. The Elbrus house, that aluminum shelter that Groth had negotiated away from the Soviets in August, was abandoned. The Germans left everything: supplies, equipment, documents. They had no choice. Carrying anything extra in those conditions meant death. The Soviet military, recognizing the propaganda value, ordered a special operation. On February 4, 1943, Soviet mountain infantry were ordered to examine the abandoned German camps on Elbrus and replace the Nazi flags with Soviet ones. The operation was led by renowned athlete Alexander Gusev. 20 soldiers divided into 3 groups to fulfill the task. They had no proper uniforms, just basic equipment needed for alpine climbing. They wore padded jackets and carried automatic weapons. The ascension took several days. On February 13, 1943, the first group reached the eastern summit of Mount Elbrus. They tore down the German flags and raised the Soviet red banner. 4 days later, on February 17, another group reached the western summit, the highest point, and did the same. The Soviet photographer captured the moment. Soviet flags on Elbrus. The Germans had been driven from the roof of Europe. The propaganda value was enormous, a perfect mirror of the German propaganda from 6 months earlier. But for the men of the 49th Mountain Corps, retreating through the frozen valleys below, the flags on Elbrus meant nothing. They were fighting for survival now. Not against the Red Army. Against the mountains. By mid-January 1943, the German command began withdrawing troops from the passes of the main Caucasian range to avoid being cut off completely after the defeat at Stalingrad. The depth of snow in the passes reached 2 meters. Fighting became impossible. Delivery of food and ammunition to the passes was impossible. Men starved. Men froze. One particularly haunting account comes from the 2nd Romanian Mountain Division, which had been fighting near the village of Kendelen. After a battle in the Baksan Gorge, an entire brigade, several hundred men, retreated down the valley. They were never seen again. Search parties found no bodies, no equipment, no signs of combat. The brigade had simply vanished into the mountains. Some speculated they had been caught in an avalanche. Others thought they might have been ambushed by Soviet partisans. The truth was never discovered. The mountains had swallowed them whole. By April 1943, the 1st Mountain Division had been pulled out of the Caucasus entirely. They were posted to Yugoslavia for anti-partisan operations. The 4th Mountain Division followed shortly after. The 49th Mountain Corps ceased to exist as an operational unit. Operation Edelweiss, the grand plan to capture the Caucasus oil fields, to knock out the Soviet Black Sea Fleet, to open the door to the Middle East, had failed completely. German forces had reached their high water mark at the town of Algiers and the city of Orjonikidze, approximately 610 kilometers from their starting positions. They had come tantalizingly close to the oil fields. But they never reached Grozny. They never reached Baku. And they certainly never reached the Black Sea coast. The strategic failure was total. The oil fields Hitler needed to fuel his war machine remained in Soviet hands. The Soviet Black Sea Fleet remained operational. The southern flank remained vulnerable. And over 100,000 German and Axis troops had been tied down in the Caucasus for 6 months, troops that could have been used elsewhere, perhaps even to prevent the encirclement at Stalingrad. But what about those 23 men who had climbed to the summit of Elbrus on August 21, 1942? What became of them? Most of their names are lost to history. We know Hauptmann Heinz Groth and Hauptmann Max Gammerler led the expedition. We know Oberfeldwebel Lorenz Kummerl planted the flag. But the others? Just names in a unit roster, if that. The German Wehrmacht kept meticulous records, but individual soldiers in the mountain divisions, especially in propaganda operations, often went unrecorded. What we do know is this: the 1st Mountain Division, after leaving the Caucasus, would go on to commit some of the worst atrocities of the war. In Yugoslavia and Greece, units from the division participated in anti-partisan operations that were, in reality, mass murder. On July 6, 1943, a unit attacked the village of Barova in Albania. All the houses were burned. 107 inhabitants were massacred, including 5 entire families. The youngest victim was 4 months old. The oldest was a 73-year-old woman. On July 25, 1943, soldiers from the division attacked the village of Mouziatitsa in Greece, killing 153 civilians. On August 16, 1943, the village of Kameno was attacked at the order of Oberstleutnant Joseph Somminger, commander of Gebirgsjäger Regiment 98. A total of 317 civilians were killed. Elements from the division took part in the murder of thousands of Italian soldiers from the 33 Acqui Infantry Division in September 1943 on the Greek island of Cephalonia following Italy's surrender. These are not the actions of the heroic mountain climbers depicted in the propaganda photos from Elbrus. These are war crimes, pure and simple, and they stain the memory of every man who wore the Edelweiss badge. The division's commander, General Lieutenant Walter Stettner Ritter von Grabenhofen, was killed in action on October 17, 1944, on Avala, a mountain near Belgrade, during the Belgrade Offensive. General Hubert Lanz, who commanded the division during the Caucasus campaign, survived the war. He surrendered to the Americans and was sentenced by the Nuremberg Tribunal to 12 years in prison for war crimes. He was released in 1951 and died in 1982. As for Mount Elbrus itself, it stands unchanged. The same frozen peak. The same brutal weather. The same deadly beauty that lured those German mountain troops to their propaganda triumph and strategic disaster. Today, Mount Elbrus is a popular climbing destination. Over 400,000 visitors come to the area each year. During the summer, it's not uncommon for 100 people to attempt the summit each day via the normal route. The climb is not technically difficult, but it's still dangerous. The average annual death toll remains 15 to 30 climbers per year. If you climb Elbrus today, you can still see remnants of the war. Rusted equipment. Shell casings. Sometimes, when the ice melts, bodies appear, soldiers who died in the battles of 1942 and 1943 and were frozen in place. Most are never identified. Soviet or German, it doesn't matter anymore. They're just bodies in the ice. There's a particular spot on the southern slope, around 4,200 meters, where the Elbrus house once stood. It burned down in 1998, and now only ruins remain. But if you know where to look, you can still see traces of the old structure. Pieces of aluminum siding, concrete foundations, a weather station that hasn't worked in 80 years. This is where Hauptmann Heinz Groth negotiated with Soviet soldiers on August 14, 1942, where German and Soviet troops exchanged gunfire in the months that followed, where men fought and died for control of a mountain hut that, in the grand scheme of the war, meant absolutely nothing. The Elbrus campaign has become a metaphor for the entire German Eastern offensive. Grand ambitions, initial success, overreach, and ultimately defeat at the hands of an enemy that couldn't be conquered, Russia itself. Not just the Red Army, but the land, the weather, the sheer impossible vastness of the country. Hitler's rage at the Elbrus climb was, in retrospect, more prophetic than anyone realized at the time. Those crazy mountain climbers, who belonged before a court-martial, had perfectly symbolized the entire Wehrmacht strategy. Spectacular, attention-grabbing victories that looked impressive but meant nothing strategically. Planting a flag on Europe's highest mountain made for great propaganda. But it didn't capture the oil fields. It didn't knock out the Soviet fleet. It didn't win the war. In the end, the Elbrus expedition was exactly what Hitler called it, a stunt. An impressive stunt, carried out by brave and skilled men, but a stunt nonetheless. And while those 23 climbers were making history on a frozen mountaintop, the real war, the war that mattered, was being lost in the valleys below. The German soldiers who climbed into hell on those Caucasus peaks in the summer of 1942 learned what every mountain climber knows. Getting to the summit is only half the battle. You still have to get back down. And in war, just like in climbing, most people who die don't die on the way up. They die on the way down. The 49th Mountain Corps reached the summit of their offensive in late August 1942. By January 1943, they were in full retreat, shattered and broken, leaving thousands of frozen corpses in the mountain passes behind them. They had climbed into hell, and most of them never climbed back out. The flags that Oberfeldwebel-Lorenz-Kummer planted on August 21, 1942, flew for less than 6 months before Soviet troops tore them down. The photographs taken that day were distributed across Germany, printed in newspapers, shown in cinemas. They were meant to inspire, to show German invincibility, to prove that nothing could stop the Wehrmacht. But those photographs tell a different story now. Look closely at them. The men are bundled in heavy coats, their faces obscured by goggles and scarves. The wind is whipping the flags so hard they're almost horizontal. The sky behind them is vast and empty. There's no victory in those images. Just exhaustion. Just men standing on a frozen rock in the middle of nowhere, thousands of meters from anything that matters. And that's the real story of the Elbrus campaign. Not heroism. Not conquest. Just exhaustion. The German military historians, writing after the war, tried to make sense of what happened in the Caucasus. They produced detailed analyses, maps showing the advance and retreat, charts of casualties and equipment losses, explanations of why Operation Edelweiss failed. But they all missed the fundamental truth: it was always going to fail. The entire premise was insane. The idea that 2 mountain divisions, even elite ones, could cross the Caucasus, descend to the Black Sea coast, capture major ports, and hold them while the rest of Army Group A pushed east toward Baku? It was fantasy. The logistics alone made it impossible. The terrain made it suicidal. And yet they tried. Because orders were orders. Because Hitler demanded it. Because the entire Nazi system was built on the idea that willpower could overcome reality. That German soldiers, properly motivated, could achieve the impossible. Mount Elbrus proved them wrong. The mountains don't care about your ideology. They don't care about your flags or your propaganda or your 1,000-year Reich. They kill you just the same. There's a moment that captures this perfectly. It comes from the diary of Gefreiter Hans Schmidt, who served with the 1st Mountain Division during the retreat in January 1943. Schmidt was 24 years old. He had climbed in the Bavarian Alps before the war. He volunteered for the mountain troops because he loved the mountains. He thought it would be like climbing at home, but with better equipment and more adventure. His diary entry from January 18, 1943, reads, "We left Feldwebel-Müller on the trail today. His feet were frozen solid. He couldn't walk anymore. We tried to carry him, but the snow was too deep. We had to leave him. He was crying. Not from pain. Just crying. He knew what it meant. We all knew. I think about him now, lying there in the snow, watching us walk away. I wonder how long it took. I hope it was quick. I hope he didn't suffer. But I know he did. Everyone suffers here. The mountains make sure of it." Schmidt survived the retreat. He made it back to German lines in March 1943, minus 3 toes on his left foot and 2 fingers on his right hand. He was sent to a hospital in Bavaria to recover. In May 1943, he was declared fit for duty and sent to Yugoslavia for anti-partisan operations. He was killed on November 4, 1943, in a partisan ambush near the village of Kalinovic. Feldwebel-Müller's body was never recovered. Neither were the bodies of thousands of other German soldiers who died in the Caucasus that winter. They're still up there. Frozen. Preserved. Occasionally, hikers find them scraps of uniform, bones, sometimes entire bodies still frozen in the positions they died in. The Russians have a term for this: Gorny Mogili, mountain graves. The Caucasus are full of them. German, Soviet, Romanian, Italian, Georgian. Thousands of men who died fighting over passes and peaks that meant nothing. Who froze to death on trails that led nowhere. Who were buried by avalanches and never seen again. And Mount Elbrus stands over them all. Silent. Indifferent. Eternal. The mountain doesn't remember the flags that were planted on its summit. It doesn't remember the men who climbed its slopes. It doesn't remember the battles fought in its shadow. It just is. A mass of rock and ice, 5,642 meters high, standing exactly where it has stood for millions of years and will stand for millions more. That's what makes the Elbrus expedition so tragic. All that effort. All that skill. All that courage. And for what? A photograph? A propaganda victory that lasted 6 months? A footnote in the history of a failed campaign? Hitler was right to be angry. Not because climbing the mountain was a waste of resources, though it was, but because it perfectly symbolized everything wrong with the German war effort. Style over substance. Spectacle over strategy. The appearance of victory rather than actual victory. The Wehrmacht in 1942 was the most professional, best trained, most effective military force in the world. German soldiers were better trained than their Soviet counterparts. German officers were more experienced. German tactics were more sophisticated. German equipment was, in many cases, superior. And yet they lost. They lost at Stalingrad. They lost in the Caucasus. They lost the war. Because wars aren't won by individual soldiers or even by elite units. Wars are won by logistics, by supply chains, by industrial production, by the ability to sustain an offensive over time and space. And Germany couldn't do that. The Wehrmacht advanced faster than it could supply itself. It conquered territory it couldn't hold. It attempted operations it couldn't sustain. The Caucasus campaign was the perfect example. The 49th Mountain Corps advanced 600 kilometers into some of the most hostile terrain on Earth. And then what? They couldn't be supplied. They couldn't be reinforced. They couldn't even communicate reliably with headquarters. They were just there. Stuck on mountainsides, slowly freezing, slowly starving, slowly dying. And when the retreat order finally came, it wasn't because they had been defeated in battle. It was because the entire southern front was collapsing and they needed to get out before they were cut off completely. That's not a military defeat. That's a systemic failure. That's what happens when your entire strategy is based on fantasy rather than reality. But let's return to the men themselves. Because whatever we say about the strategy, about Hitler's decisions, about the futility of the campaign. These were still human beings. Soldiers doing their duty. Men who believed they were fighting for their country. Who showed courage and skill and endurance that deserves respect, even if the cause they fought for doesn't. Take Hauptmann Heinz Groth. We know very little about him after the Caucasus campaign. He survived the war, we know that much. His name appears in post-war records. But what happened to him? Did he return to climbing after the war? Did he ever go back to the mountains? Did he think about that moment on August 14, 1942, when he walked into the Elbrus house alone and negotiated the surrender of the Soviet garrison? Did he feel pride? Or shame? Or just the numbness that so many veterans feel when they look back at what they did during the war? We don't know. Groth never gave interviews. Never wrote a memoir. He disappeared into post-war Germany and lived out his life in obscurity. Maybe that was a choice. Maybe he didn't want to talk about it. Maybe the memories were too painful. Or maybe he just wanted to forget. The same is true for most of the men who climbed Elbrus that day. 23 names. Most of them lost to history. A few scattered references in unit records. Nothing more. They had their moment of glory, that photograph, that flag, that summit. And then they vanished into the chaos of the war. Some died in Yugoslavia. Some died on the Eastern Front. Some survived and went home and never spoke about what they had seen. That was common among Wehrmacht veterans. The war was something to be forgotten, not remembered. Something to be buried, not discussed. But the mountain remembers. In its own way. Every year, climbers ascending Elbrus find artifacts from the war. A helmet half buried in the ice. A rusted rifle. Dog tags with German names. Sometimes, when conditions are right, entire campsites emerge from the glacier's tents, equipment, supplies, all perfectly preserved by the cold. In 2013, a group of Russian climbers found a cache of German documents at around 4,500 meters on the southern slope. Maps, orders, letters home, all frozen together in a block of ice. They carefully extracted them and turned them over to a museum in Turskal, the mountain village at the base of Elbrus. Among the documents was a letter from a soldier named Klaus Reinhardt to his mother. The letter was dated September 15, 1942, almost a month after the summit climb. Reinhardt wrote, "We are still on the mountain. I don't know how much longer we can stay here. The supplies are not coming. The weather is getting worse. Yesterday we lost 3 men to an avalanche. We heard them screaming, but we couldn't reach them. By the time the snow stopped moving, they were gone. We didn't even try to dig them out. There's no point. The mountain takes what it wants." The letter was never sent. Reinhardt probably died before he could get it to a mailbox. His body has never been found. That's what the Caucasus campaign was really about. Not the propaganda photos. Not the flags on the summit. But men like Klaus Reinhardt, writing letters to their mothers from a frozen mountainside, knowing they were probably going to die there. And die they did. The casualty figures for the 49th Mountain Corps during the Caucasus campaign are difficult to pin down precisely. German records from this period are incomplete, and the Soviets didn't always distinguish between regular casualties and those from mountain warfare. But estimates suggest that the 2 German mountain divisions suffered approximately 8,000 to 10,000 casualties, killed, wounded, missing, or incapacitated by frostbite between August 1942 and January 1943. That's roughly 25 to 30% of their total strength. And most of those casualties didn't come from combat. They came from the mountains, from exposure, from frostbite, from avalanches, from falls, from simple exhaustion. The Soviets suffered even worse. The Red Army units defending the passes were often poorly equipped for mountain warfare. They had inadequate winter clothing, limited medical support, minimal mountain training. But they had one advantage: they were defending. They didn't have to advance through the snow. They just had to hold their positions. And they did, at enormous cost. Soviet casualties in the Caucasus Mountain battles are estimated at 15,000 to 20,000 dead, with tens of thousands more wounded or missing. Many of these men were from Central Asian republics: Uzbeks, Kazakhs, Tajiks, sent to fight in mountains they had never seen before, for reasons they probably didn't fully understand. When you add up the German casualties, the Soviet casualties, the Romanian casualties, the Italian casualties, you're looking at something like 50,000 men dead or missing in the Caucasus Mountains between August 1942 and February 1943. 50,000 men. For nothing. Because that's the ultimate truth of the Caucasus campaign: it achieved nothing. The oil fields were never captured. The Black Sea Fleet was never neutralized. The Southern Front was never secured. All that death, all that suffering, all that effort, and the strategic situation in late 1942 was exactly the same as it had been before the offensive began. Worse, actually. Because now Germany had committed its reserve forces to a failed offensive. Now the Southern Front was overextended and vulnerable. Now Stalingrad was encircled, and Army Group A was in danger of being cut off entirely. The Caucasus campaign didn't just fail, it actively contributed to Germany's strategic collapse in the south. And Mount Elbrus? That magnificent propaganda victory? By February 1943, Soviet flags were flying where German flags had flown 6 months earlier. The photographs of Soviet soldiers on the summit were just as dramatic, just as symbolic, as the German photos had been. Except this time, they represented actual victory. The Germans were in retreat. The Soviets were advancing. The tide had turned. Hitler never forgave his generals for the Caucasus failure. General Feldmarschall Wilhelm List, commander of Army Group A, was relieved of command in September 1942, partly for the slow progress, partly because Hitler needed a scapegoat. Hitler briefly took personal command of Army Group A himself, directing operations from his headquarters over 2,000 kilometers away. It was a disaster, and he soon appointed General Feldmarschall Ewald von Kleist to the position. But the damage was done. The relationship between Hitler and his senior commanders, already strained after the Moscow offensive failed in 1941, deteriorated completely. Hitler increasingly mistrusted his generals. He second-guessed their decisions. He issued orders that made no military sense but couldn't be questioned. The professional Wehrmacht officer corps, which had been the backbone of German military success, was sidelined in favor of ideological loyalty. And the soldiers paid the price. There's a final piece to this story. A coda that brings everything full circle. In 1945, as the war was ending, a Soviet mountain infantry unit was training in the Caucasus. They were preparing for potential operations in mountainous terrain, possibly against Japan, which was still fighting at that point, or possibly for occupation duties in Austria and Switzerland. During a training exercise, one of the soldiers, a young lieutenant named Viktor Sokolov, found something strange on a trail near Mount Elbrus. It was a German mountain boot. Still laced. Still containing a foot. Sokolov reported it to his commander, and they organized a search of the area. Over the next 3 days, they found the remains of 11 German soldiers. All had died in roughly the same location, probably during the retreat in January 1943. They had likely been caught in a blizzard or an avalanche. Their bodies had been preserved by the cold for over 2 years. The Soviet commander ordered the bodies to be buried properly. They dug a grave in a small clearing near the trail, placed all the remains inside, and marked it with a simple wooden cross. No names. No identification. Just 11 German soldiers who died fighting for a cause they probably didn't understand, in a place they probably didn't want to be, for objectives that meant nothing. That grave is still there. Or at least, it was there in the 1990s when Western climbers started returning to the Caucasus after the fall of the Soviet Union. Whether it still exists today, I don't know. The wooden cross would have rotted away decades ago. The grave might have been washed out by erosion or buried by a landslide. The mountains reclaim everything eventually. But somewhere on the slopes of Mount Elbrus, there are 11 German soldiers still lying where they fell. Along with hundreds of others. Along with thousands of Soviet soldiers. along with Romanians and Italians and Georgians and all the other men who died fighting over these mountains in 1942 and 1943. They're all equal now. German and Soviet. Winner and loser. They're all just bodies in the ice. The mountain doesn't distinguish between them. To the mountain, they're all the same. All invaders. All temporary. All forgotten. And that's the ultimate lesson of the Caucasus campaign. Of the Elbrus expedition. Of the entire Wehrmacht experience in World War II. You can plant your flags. You can take your photographs. You can claim victory. But the mountain doesn't care. The mountain will still be there long after your flags have rotted away, long after your photographs have faded, long after everyone who remembers you is dead. The Germans who climbed into hell on Mount Elbrus in August 1942 learned that lesson the hard way. They thought they were conquerors. They thought they were making history. They thought they were achieving something that would be remembered forever. They were wrong. History remembers the Elbrus expedition as a footnote. A curiosity. A minor propaganda stunt in the middle of a failed campaign. The men who climbed that mountain, who risked their lives for that photograph, who believed they were doing something important, they've been forgotten. Their names don't appear in the history books. Their faces in those propaganda photos are obscured by goggles and scarves. They're anonymous. Interchangeable. Lost. The only thing that remains is the mountain itself. Still standing. Still indifferent. Still claiming lives 15 to 30 every year, even now, 80 years after the war. Mount Elbrus is 5,642 meters high. It has been that height for millions of years. It will be that height for millions of years more. The Germans came and went. The Soviets came and went. And the mountain remains. That's the real story of Operation Edelweiss. Not conquest. Not victory. Not even defeat. Just the eternal, indifferent presence of the mountains. And the tiny, fragile, temporary presence of men who thought they could conquer them. They couldn't. They never could. And the frozen corpses scattered across the Caucasus passes are the proof. The Germans who climbed into hell learned too late that hell doesn't let you leave. Some climbed back out, frostbitten and traumatized, and lived to tell the tale though most chose not to. Others stayed there forever, frozen in the ice, preserved like insects in amber, waiting for the glaciers to slowly carry them down the mountain over the next 1,000 years. And somewhere, at 5,642 meters, where the air is thin and the wind never stops and the temperature never rises above freezing, there's a spot where Oberfeldwebel Lorenz Kummerl once stood with a flag in his hands. There's nothing there now. No marker. No monument. No trace that anything ever happened. Just rock and ice and wind and cold and the endless, indifferent sky. The Germans came to Mount Elbrus in August 1942 believing they were invincible. They left in January 1943 knowing they were mortal. And the mountain stands today exactly as it stood then, exactly as it stood 1,000,000 years ago, exactly as it will stand 1,000,000 years from now. Unchanged. Unconquered. Eternal. And utterly, completely, indifferent to the men who thought they could claim it as their own.